And I'll just start with broadly how hazing is defined, or at least how you define it.
I define it as a group that is using activities to maintain a pecking order or a hierarchy or to discipline. And the kinds of activities are either physically or psychologically harmful or potentially harmful. The policies and actual laws for each college and high school and state will differ, and they'll usually give very good examples of what is not allowed, like forced drinking, kidnapping, burning somebody, all kinds of sexual activities that might go on. But I like to keep it kind of broad and really emphasize the fact that there's a hierarchy that's being taught. And the way that they teach the rules and rituals is through hazing.
And so that group element is an important part of it, right? Like it's different from bullying.
Yes, actually, I'm an expert in bullying too. And the way I define bullying is that it's a one-on-one activity. It's usually spontaneous, and it's where someone has more power over another person and wants to demonstrate that. So in elementary school, they'll take your lunch. When they're older, they'll take money, or they'll threaten somebody, or they'll get social status by bullying an individual. In hazing, it's completely a group activity. It's planned. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And at the end, the victim, the person who's hazed, has now become or accepted as a member of that group. So the hazing process is to prove that you're good enough to be in this group.
Right. And can you walk through some of maybe the most common activities that take place with hazing, and whether that differs with different kinds of groups, athletics versus Greek life versus military, that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. So typically, they want people to feel comfortable as they're being hazed. So they often start with like cross-dressing, dressing up like Halloween, having a party, having a lot of alcohol. So people feel like, oh, I know how to do this. With fraternities, they start with lineup, and it's like when you're 5 years old and you have to line up in size order or something like that. What they don't tell you about is that you're going to have to drink 18 drinks in 2 hours or something, and that the binge drinking will make you completely intoxicated and might cause brain damage. They don't tell you about that part. In athletic hazing, for example, there's usually something more physical, calisthenics. Lately meaning the last decade, across America, there's been sexualized hazing. On boys' team, a lot of sodomy and a lot of any kind of penetration or mock penetration. So that causes two things. One is obviously physical, and the second is psychological, because young boys want to protect their masculinity. And part of high school hazing is that everybody knows about it. So everybody on the team knows about it, then everybody in the school and the community know about it. So there's like no hiding.
Do you know why that is? That trend of sexualized hazing has become more common?
I have a theory. So I haven't done actual research to tell you if my theory is correct. I think that what has happened is that hazing in general, especially in high school, happened when in an area and a time that is either there are no adults around, it's undersupervised, or it's undersupervised or it's completely not supervised. And so the students on a team, they know exactly where the adults are, but they have a short amount of time to haze. So if you do something sexual, you're getting the most bang for your buck, so to speak, because you get the victim to feel completely helpless and understand the hierarchy immediately in a very quick way. And it's very hard to fight back. Even if victims do fight back, they usually just get hazed worse. So I think that the sexualized hazing has increased because it's an easy, quick way of letting you know that you are at the bottom of the ladder and you have no power.
How prevalent do we know hazing is today? How is it easy for us to know that? Is it hard for us to know that?
From my point of view, even though I have statistics on my website and there are lots of statistics floating around, I think we absolutely do not know how much hazing is happening, because most of it is only reported when it reaches the news. And it only gets reported when it reaches the news when somebody is so badly damaged, either physically or psychologically, that they break through. And typically it's not the victim who breaks through, it's somebody who knows somebody who comes to the authorities. So I would say that there are thousands of hazings that go on every day across the country, in high school, in college, in the military, also in business, and in kitchens, and in restaurants, all kinds of ways there that hazing is happening, and that they mostly go unreported. So no, we don't have any good statistics. I think there's an old statistic that the NCAA said something like 79% of the athletes coming from high school to college have been hazed already before they get into college. And I actually have a theory that I call the blueprint of hazing, and that is that somebody comes in and wants to be a member of a group or a team, and they get hazed, and then they become a bystander and they watch as others get hazed. Now it's their time. Now they have senior status and they feel like they have the right and the duty to pass on the ritual. Then they pack that whole experience up in their backpack and take it with them to college or the military or the workplace. And they expect to be hazed and expect to haze others.
Yeah, you talked about how it's not so often the victim that's making the report about the hazing happening. It's somebody that heard a rumor or knows that it happened but wasn't taking part in it in any way specifically. Why is it that victims, whether it's in the moment when the hazing is happening or later on, find it hard to speak out against it or make it known that it's happening?
Well, there's a very strong code of silence, which is taught immediately in any group that hazes. So if it's an athletic team, if it's a fraternity, a sorority, you name it, they have taught the code of silence, which is silence is golden. What goes on in the locker room stays in the locker room. And everybody has been intimidated so that they would be afraid to actually come forward and give information on a hazing or something like that, because they will be ostracized, they will not be accepted on the team. And from my point of view, I've seen when it does break, let's say on a college campus, most often the victim has to actually leave the college. So it's a pretty scary thing. It's really scary to be hazed. And then it's what I call the second hazing, when the whole community finds out. And usually about 85% of the people who support, let's say, the coach and the athletic team, and then 15% will support the victim. And those 15% who are supporting the victim or the victims are usually harassed, and they too may need to leave town because it's so strong. And in this day and age, meaning in the 21st century, being socially accepted is so important that it really would take a very brave person to come forward.
Yeah, something that you've definitely touched on already, that maybe you could expand on more. The psychology behind why people actually do this. I think a lot of people who haven't experienced hazing firsthand, they're like, I could never do that to somebody. It's hard to imagine inflicting that kind of pain on another person. How do people end up in a place where they can justify that to themselves?
It's really interesting. I think that what happens is, if you could imagine a doorway and above it, it says hazing, and all these moral kids, like, there've been very bad hazings with, Boy Scouts, with leadership people, with, 24% of the kids in church groups haze also. So people who have a morality will go into the hazing doorway, they drop their morality and their individual judgment, and they go through, and now the first thing they need is the code of silence. And along with that is a lot of fear. And so what's going on is that they're doing unto others what was done to them. And unfortunately, we see that all over the place. So like with child abuse, children who've been abused often end up being abusers. Children whose parents have been drug addicts or alcoholics often follow the same path, even though they say, I'll never do that. So what happens is we imitate behaviors. And then we have here in hazing, you have the group dynamics and the peer pressure. And more important to most kids in, let's say, high school, is to be accepted, to have a group, to have an identity, and to feel that you're part of, a group. And so that they will do whatever they have to do, and when you think about it, in athletics, coaches will run people hard and make them do all kinds of things, and you do whatever you have to do in order to get on that team. um, Unfortunately, we do whatever we have to do to get into college, and people do whatever they have to do to get a job and keep a job, right? There are a lot of things that we would not do if we were not forced or coerced in some way, whether that is overt or covert, obvious or not. So it's hard to imagine. I think that, like, for example, in fraternity hazings, very frequently kids will be hurt in the hazing and nobody will call 911. I know for a fact that if that was the same thing, somebody's, completely drunk and they've hurt themselves in some way, and everybody, they're bleeding or they have a concussion or something, I'm sure if it was your friend, if it was your brother, you would call 911 right away. Within the confines of the fraternity, they're not allowed. They have to wait for the head, the president or the pledge master or somebody who's in charge to call 911. So they usually don't. And, I'm an expert witness in a lot of cases. And what happens is, if only the kids called 911 earlier. So there's a kind of, I guess it's the code of silence, and a kind of ritual and a kind of hierarchy. And you learn, just like maybe you wouldn't do something that your father wouldn't let you do, or the coach wouldn't want you to do. It's the same kind of thinking.
As you've gone through your research and you've talked to people about hazing over the years, what are some of the misconceptions that seem to really stick with people that you have to dispel?
Well, I would say a huge number of people actually enjoy hazing. They enjoy the process of having been in it and doing it to other people, and they'll look back and say, "Oh, it's the best time of my life." They will also say it really bonded me, made me feel, like these band of brothers. These are my brothers. They'll be there for me forever. So there's this positive spin that the larger culture has about hazing. And the other part is that they think that anybody who comes forward is a pussy, is soft. Why did you break the code of silence? It happened to me, it'll happen to you, it's no big deal, you don't have any spine. And they put them out. Now, maybe they know what happened, but most probably they don't. And if it was their child, they wouldn't want that to happen to them. But it's very hard to think about it as their child. So they kind of generalize it. And maybe, there are movies that, make it look like it's a lot of fun. And in the beginning, it is a lot of fun. That's how they draw you in, like, hey, fun and games, and then trust us. And then each hazing has many, usually it's more than one event, it's many events. So as the events go on, they get worse and worse and worse. And for example, in fraternities, the last week is called Hell Week, and it is really the worst. In athletic teams, they may have different kinds of doing it, but it's usually not just once.
And that goal that they have, or say that they have, about bringing people together, having them bond, is there, I know we talked about statistics and data can be hard to measure in these situations, but has the research shown that it does bring teams closer together, or does that, I mean, violent behavior that they're inflicting on one another, does it drive people apart?
Um, I'm not very clear on the research. I can tell you from my clinical experience. Okay. So let's say in a fraternity, you have the freshmen or the youngest people who are coming in. They will bond as they're all being hazed. And as they go on, they're still bonding. So it's like the first year, the second year, the third year. They hate the people who did it to them, which are like the seniors. So I guess it's like within group, there is a bonding that occurs. Now, I would argue that if instead of hurting each other, they had to build a house for Habitat for Humanity, they would also bond. If they were doing a pro-social versus an anti-social group of activities, I think the bonding would still take place. However, the people who are doing it are not really interested in listening to me or doing a pro-social kind of activity. And that's not what the ritual is. And they're into repeating the ritual. So you can look at a particular kind of fraternity and they have chapters all through the country and they're doing the same ritual more or less across the country.
Yeah, they're not about to go out and start volunteering on the weekends as a replacement.
Well, it's funny because a lot of the fraternities will have on their websites that we're all about brotherhood and we're philanthropic. So they do philanthropic things. So do the sororities, and they actually do raise money and they actually do things that are positive. It's sort of like on the outside. On the inside, however, their hazing rituals are not pro-social. Um, I don't know if that would ever change.
Right. Yeah. I want to bring it back to kind of the history of hazing, its origins, how old it is. We talked about changes that have happened recently, but in terms of hazing itself, is it a new phenomenon or is this something that goes way back?
I think it goes way back to probably ancient Greece and Rome, where they had servitude. We know that in the United States, it came over, I think, from Oxford to Harvard in the 1800s, and it was called fagging. And fagging had to do with servitude and pranking. And then it grew from there. And of course, we have our own American spin on it, and we're quite good at developing these kinds of activities.
So this isn't something that even originated with athletics, even though it's very associated with athletics.
Oh, no, definitely. I mean, actually, it's associated with athletics, particularly in high school, but it's really started in college and associated with fraternities and sororities, and definitely in the military. There's hazing across the world, and many militaries have hazing as part of the process of it's not the legal process, of becoming familiar with each other. So in the United States, it's athletics in high school. There's not a lot of fraternities and sororities anymore in high school. If there were, I would guess you would see it there. But we do see it in other kinds of groups. We see it in marching bands. We see it in leadership clubs, as I said. So it's not only athletics, it's in any group that has a hierarchy and they want you to learn that hierarchy and that you must obey that. So there is, like, for example, if you had a rock band, it's unlikely that there would be hazing. If you had a marching band, it's likely that there would be hazing. It's two different kinds of bands and two different kinds of people, and the kind of hierarchy and the whole what culture is different.
Yeah, and I guess that hierarchy piece would explain when you have a group where it's not a question of membership, right? Like you already tried out for the football team, you're on it. Or, you enlisted in the military, you're there. It's no one can kick you out because you say no to hazing. But that hierarchical structure, would you say that is what then psychologically convinces people not to speak out against it when it's happening? They're still trying to belong in a different sense.
Well, this is a very interesting concept, and that is, do they have a choice? So let's say you wanted to join a girls' soccer team, and now the coach says, "Yeah, you're great. We want you here." But the people on the team say, "Well, you might be on the team, but we're going to make your life really difficult unless you do what we tell you to do." And we are going to intimidate you. And typically, for let's say freshmen and sophomores, they're typically physically smaller than juniors and seniors. On top of, they have a lot of status, and the younger people know that the older people have like a lot of status. So you're intimidated. You don't have a choice. It's not really very easy to not do that if this is the culture of your group. So you don't have a choice. And I think that that's really important, that there is no choice in hazing. You're stuck. You want to be part of the team? This is what we do. We don't tell you about it in advance. The coach doesn't say, and by the way, the team hazes, and this and this and this might happen to you, and you might end up in the hospital, or like in fraternity hazing, you might end up dead. No, we don't tell you that. And for the most part in high school, most coaches will deny that they know anything about it, even though that may or may not be true. And in fraternities, the same kind of denial will occur. So you don't really have a choice if you want to be on a team and that team happens to have hazing as part of the team. Not all athletic teams have it. Not all sororities and fraternities do it.
Given the state laws that are in place and the way organizations have responded to hazing, I know the university I went to, I was in Greek life. Thankfully, there was no hazing in my organization, but I know that we did lots of trainings that were anti-hazing. Just largely speaking, there are preventative educational efforts and there are legal efforts that are happening. And I would be willing to bet that, it's happening at Pitt, which was the university I went to. It's also happening at most large universities that have Greek life. And, why is it still prevalent if these efforts are taking shape?
Well, it's kind of like, why do people speed? I would say that most of your audience probably speeds at least some of the time. Everybody speeds, even then they know there's a speeding limit. I think a lot of people drink and probably drink more than they should, and probably even drive or smoke pot and drive and do all those things. So, basically, just because there's a law or a policy, there'll be some portion of the population which will follow the rules. And then a larger portion of the population that will test the limits and will not follow the rules. And then, I particularly don't see hazing as getting better. I've been studying it for like more than 20 years, and I think it's actually getting worse. I think it's more prevalent. It's more integrated into high schools and colleges. And I think that the kinds of hazing that I'm reading about in cases from, let's say, the early 2000s until now is much more violent, much more aggressive, and it's trending upwards as far as I'm concerned.
Do you think, what factors do you think have played into that?
Well, in Greek life, for example, there are more chapters have been created since like 2005. It's just growing larger and larger and larger. And I think part of that is the social media. So in the last century, where we didn't have social media, people wanted to be in groups, but the degree of having an identity and being part of a group was not as strong as I think it has been with social media. And social media makes the communication much more alive and in real time. And so it feels, I think, to young people that the normal developmental desire to be part of a group is heightened to such a degree that when you go to college, you feel like you must be part of a group. It's like that's part of your identity, whatever your group is, and you're assuming that that group will protect you and that that group will be good for you, which may or may not be true. So I think that the social media aspect of this century and the culture of this century has created more need to be in those groups, and those groups often have hazing as part of the ritual.
So is there something that can be done that's not already being done, or something that can be done better than it is right now to stop hazing or prevent it from happening? Or I don't know, are you pessimistic about the future, given that it seems to be getting worse despite all these efforts that are happening?
Yes, I'm pessimistic about the future. I think that I would like to see people, two things. One is, like the Black Lives Matter movement, and if there was a movement from inside where the students who are being hazed could get together and say, no, we're stopping this ritual, this is not good. I think that would be helpful, but I don't think that's going to happen. The other thing would be to train people on how to do that as a group. Like as a group of freshmen, we can only stop it if we gather as a group and have the strength of the group to go against the authority figure. If one person tries to go against the authority figure, they will be hazed worse. That's absolutely true from all my clinical experience. And that often happens in sexualized hazings, where the kids try to defend themselves, and it gets worse and worse and worse. So I think, if we could train people to have positive group dynamics, and they did it, that would work. But if you train them to be positive, they could also flip and do it in a negative way and be more intimidating, more coercive. So I think that I am probably not the best person to talk about hazing as coming to an end. There might be I can tell you some other people. Elizabeth Allen has done a lot of research. She might be more helpful and hopeful.
Yeah, she is someone that I reached out to actually, so I'm hoping she'll get back to me soon about, because she clearly, like you said, she's done a lot of research on this area, so I'd really like to get her opinion. Um, you know, when it comes to the approach, I'm curious if you have an opinion. There seems to be two branches. One is preventative and educational, right? We're going to teach people what hazing looks like. We're going to teach them why it's wrong, why they shouldn't do it to other people, and what they should do if it happens to them, right? Like that's when I say the trainings I went through as a Greek life student, that's like that. Then there's of course the law, right? I would assume all states, but I'm actually not sure. I would assume most, at least, it's illegal to haze. Certainly the assault is illegal, rape is illegal, so those things would fall under that category. In terms of that more like legal punitive approach or the preventative educational approach, do you have any indication of what's more effective?
Well, I actually just thought of one more thing. You said, is there anything we can do to be preventative? So I think what we don't have is we don't have a 1-800 number that people could just call to say, I think there's a hazing going on, and here it is, and this is the information. There are different fraternities, for example, that have that, but it goes back to the fraternity or it goes back to their lawyer. So it's not exactly unbiased, It's interesting that in the United States, we have that for domestic violence and child abuse, but we don't have it for hazing or bullying or harassment. You would think at this point that it would be a valid kind of process. The other issue is that investigating a hazing is very difficult because people don't come forward because it's of the code of silence and their fear. And I find that most people who aren't doing it are not well trained on how to do it because it is different than other kinds of events that they might be investigating. Okay, in terms of do I think prevention works? So the workshops that you had to go to, don't do this, all of that other stuff. I guess I would ask you, as somebody who went through it, do you think that was effective? And if so, to whom? Was it effective to the kids who were going to follow the rules anyhow? Did it change the minds of the people who weren't going to follow the rules? And we kind of know that, in advance, you can figure that out. My feeling about particularly the age group of, let's say, high school, college, and, young adulthood, I don't think that they care about what the law says. I don't think that stops them from doing something. I think much more efficient would be the social group. Like if the social group takes your keys away so that you don't drive drunk, friends won't let friends drive drunk. That's been the only, I think, public service announcement that has ever worked. So if that happens, yeah, that's more likely than it's against the law to drive drunk. So I think that probably if we could figure out how to use the social group in a positive way to curb negative behavior, that would be great. I have been looking for that for more than 20 years and I haven't figured it out.
And I want to talk a little bit more too about the role that the authority figures play in this, with these institutions, whether it's a university or a fraternity organization, sorority organization, like the national level, not just that chapter, but sororities as like an entity, or the coach on a football team, or the school administration even. Do you feel like they are structured in a way, or that they behave in a way that prioritizes the victims, or are they prioritizing something else?
It's interesting. I've been asked to speak to coaches, for example, in high school. And I asked them, so how much time do you spend talking about hazing? They say about 60 seconds. I say, how come you spend so much time? And they say, well, we're going to lose our job unless we win. So we spend all our time training kids to learn how to play football or whatever the sport is. And they don't really, at the end of the workshop, they really understand it, but they don't really want to pay attention to the fact that hazing may or may not be happening and it may or may not become known. But once it gets known, mostly coaches get fired. Very frequently the school will fire the coach like this before they've even done an investigation because they could have or should have known what was going on. So I think that there is an internal hierarchy in both the Greek system and in, let's say, a school system, where the coach is given tremendous amount of power by the students, by the parents, and by the like superintendent, the whole group. Sometimes coaches are paid more than the superintendent. It's incredible. They don't typically have training in how to manage a group, how to deal with adolescents who are developing, or how to look for a hazing. I don't know that they want to look for those kinds of behaviors either. So I think that what happens is there's a certain amount of denial or looking the other way, because mostly the coaches have grown up in a sport and they themselves have been hazed and have hazed others. So it's part of the culture. They expect it. They look the other way. It's used to maintain their hierarchy and to discipline. I've had college soccer, the leader of a college soccer team actually say to me, they don't give me methods to discipline these kids, so I have to haze them. That's how we discipline. So, I think that it goes up the chain. So the coach is supposed to take responsibility. Everybody in the school should be trained on knowing how to see the symptoms of hazing and a college campus. And I know on college campuses that they know that kids are being hazed right now. They're wearing green hoodies and carrying a pumpkin, or, you can see it. I'm sure that the security knows it. I know that the students know it. I've had kids tell me every year at this place at midnight, you're going to see the girls running around and the boys are going to be naked, and it happens every year. So if the kids know it happens every year, shouldn't the college people know that happens? So there are all these layers of administration, and obviously the top, the president or the superintendent, they also should be trained, and they have to send the message that this is important. Do I think they do that? Not until it happens. Not until there's a lawsuit. Not until there's a breakdown, like in Northwestern a couple of years ago in football team.
That takes me right to my next question, which is when there is an incident, whether it's in a certain fraternity chapter and then the national organization for that fraternity finds out, or it's on the football team and then the school finds out, but maybe it hasn't broken to the media yet, right? There hasn't been a lawsuit yet. Those kinds of things where the institution becomes aware. Is that code of silence concept, does that extend, do you think, like the prioritization of secrecy or image, maintaining this everything's fine?
So there are two things about that. One is that as I said earlier, I think that there are many, many hazings that never are known because people don't come forward. And the only reason they do come forward, and the only reason that they will have a lawsuit, is when it has broken a certain threshold, usually psychological and physical. The second thing is, one trend that I have seen over the 20 years is that I was involved in a case in 2003, which were 3 kids in a preseason football camp that were sodomized with icy hot and golf balls, etc. And there was a lot of press. It was national press. Soon after, most of the high schools started to get a public relations team. And so you could see that as the hazings increased and spread across the United States, so did the public relations that would close down whatever was being given to the news, and it would become more and more homogenized and such that people wouldn't know what happened, and it would go on to the next thing. So I think that yes, I don't know if they're in complete denial or the complete code of silence, but basically there is a whole methodology to reduce the knowledge to the general public.
Right. I think we've reached the end of my questions. I'm almost disappointed. This has been such an interesting conversation. I've really enjoyed it. Which is strange given the subject, it's not a pleasant thing, but it is such an interesting topic. And just to think about, kind of like I said before, we all know it's bad. The awareness has grown a lot. I think awareness of hazing, I think, has increased.
Correct.
And yet it's still prevalent. And in your view, it's getting worse.
Right. I think that, they did a lot of statistics around bullying in around 2011, 12, 13. They had increased anti-bully education, let's say in elementary school. And what they found was that many more people were aware of bullying and could define it, but the incidences were not being reduced. And I think that is probably what's happening in hazing. So you'll have kids who know that, yeah, this is hazing and I'm being hazed and I'm hazing somebody else. They actually use the word and they can define it. Will they define it to the authorities? No, I don't think so. But do they themselves know what's going on? Yes, they do. And as I said, while you were walking around your university, you probably knew who was being hazed. You might not know exactly what was going on because of the code of silence, but you could see the black and blue marks, or you could see that they couldn't go to school, or that their GPA dropped, or that, they had ended up in the hospital, right? You knew all those things. So it's kind of, I guess it's a kind of knowing and not knowing at the same time that we all live with. And we don't know when to report and what to report, because we know we're not the only people seeing it. So somebody should have reported it, and we don't want to get into trouble. We don't want somebody else to get into trouble. So I think it's a much harder kind of and larger conversation. The one thing I would say about, we were starting to talk about the national and the local and Greek organizations. I don't think that the general public understands how a Greek organization is organized. So there's a national group, which is a not-for-profit group, but they make a lot of money. And the way they make money is by having people join, so their fees, or living in their houses. And so through the rent, basically. So one of the issues of the people who are, let's say, part of the fraternity living in the house is they have pressure on them to attract more people so that the national makes more money. So it's a kind of interesting business model, and one wonders whether it really should be not for profit, and whether parents understand that this is a business. This is not like just a Greek organization, philanthropic and nice for your child to have, and that they'll protect you. It has a whole other, let's say, engine underneath it. And so there's the national, and then they have local chapters. So they're, all across the country in lots of different universities and colleges. And those local groups are the ones who are hazing and may or may not be communicating with the national, who's supposed to be watching them. And then what they don't understand is when a terrible hazing happens, kids do get hurt. They're not warned that they might get hurt or that they might die. There's lots of kids who die every year through hazing. And that their parents are not actually understanding that their homeowners insurance are at risk, because if their child is part of the people who are being sued for being hazed, that's where they go and they get the money. And that their child could end up in jail. Their child could end up, in some kind of legal problem. So when you join, you're not really told the truth. You're not really given the whole story. Going into a surgery, here are the risks, and, do you want to do it? And here's the benefit. When you go into these organizations, they don't say, here are the risks. They don't say, this is how much it's going to cost. They don't say, this is, they tell you the benefits, but they don't tell you about what might happen if this all goes wrong. And I don't think that the viewing public really understands that.